What's up, guys? Welcome to Roensch Capital Charts. Today we're taking a look at the ever so hot SoundHound AI stock, ticker symbol SOUN, on a variety of time frames in anticipation of the next trading day, Thursday, March 14th. Alright guys, if you're not at least paying attention to SoundHound stock, I think you're missing out on something. It's up $1.72 today, 24.82% to the upside. This stock is clearly in play as of late, meaning it has the attention of traders, contributing to a heck of a lot of volatility and a whole lot of volume. So let's go ahead and take a peek here. Now, some big things happening after hours. The stock closed at $8.65, which is what my initial 24.82% was calculated based on. However, if we look here, it is currently up, at least as of the recording of this video. Let's just round off to 10. Plus 15.6%. Of course, that volatility is likely to continue into the end of after hours, so it's likely different wherever you're watching right now. Now, typically, in most videos, which is the case 99% of the time, I always warn the viewer, you, take after hours with a grain of salt, because volume is almost always incredibly low. That's not really the case today. I oftentimes say if you can match or exceed kind of the lunch hour volume intraday, you have a little bit more definitive of a move, at least based on the sample size that's competing for those shares, contributing to that volatility in the after hours. We have quite a bit of volume here in the after hours. Hundreds of thousands of shares consistently being traded on each 1 minute bar. So that being said, let's start here with our daily ritual, the volume profile analysis on the 5-minute chart. This is where we try to pick out any potential bias that we possibly can using the volume on what I think is the best chart to do it on, the 5-minute intraday. And this can help us pick out little forms of bias that are not entirely obvious by the movement in stock price itself. Now, make sure you wait until we get to the daily chart. That's where I think this after hours movement really becomes obvious, and we'll take a look at that. But first, we have to go through the paces here. By the way, if you have not done so already, many of you have, I greatly appreciate it. Please subscribe to the channel. My goal here is to hit 5,000 by market open this coming Monday, and I know that based on the speed that we're growing at already, by the way, I greatly appreciate it. I know we can blow that away with your guys' help, but it's not going to happen without you. So I appreciate you jumping aboard. Let's take a look. Bias. What can we pull out of here today? Because, of course, we have some pretty obvious stock movement. Is it supported by the volume profile, though? Now, if you're in chat rooms, Stock Twits, Reddit, whatever tonight, our free Discord, wherever you're at, and you're talking with people, you are, in case, if people are paying attention, you're probably going to see a bear, or more than a few, saying, yeah, but did you see that big red bar off the open, or those 2 red bars off the open? This is clearly, overextended. We had some bearish bias off the open, obviously, and then it just took off for no reason. Well, something you learn when you start doing a lot of volume profile analysis, which again, I'm doing every single day on every stock on the channel, is that context is the key, and we expect to see big volume off the open. That's not unexpected at all. So compared to the rest of the day's volume, contextually speaking, if this sell volume off the open was 9 million shares per candle, right, and the rest of these, or per bar I suppose, and the rest of these were the same, all of a sudden it's no longer contextual. But since we oftentimes expect that opening bar to be the highest volume bar on the day, this is well within reason. Now, as far as actually picking out bias, oftentimes what I'll do is I'll circle the most obvious moves. So I will do that today, and then we'll also look at the after hours kind of peak at 10:54, at least the peak as of right now. If we see a continuation move higher, or we may fade, and both of those are both possibilities. We'll talk about it on the daily chart. But again, listen, as always, the test is really the open the following day. But as far as picking out little obvious moves that we want to look at the correlating volume on, today was such a huge upside trend day that the entire move is kind of obvious, right? So what I want to do is I want to look at the volume, and we see here, this is really interesting. We get the contextual fade off the open. That's not unexpected at all. Once you bottom out, this is where you can really start, you know, if nothing was out of context here, this is where you can really start looking, because oftentimes the most typical volume profile that I see on most stocks is kind of a U shape, right? Kind of more of a clean U shape through the lunch hour, and then maybe a closing bar that's 1/3 to 2/3 the size of the opening bar. All right, somewhere around half the size. So what we have here is on this upside green move, you have consistently higher green volume. You know, it's surrounded by a couple red bars, but the ratio here is clearly to the green side on an up move. So that, in that moment, tells me that, okay, a lot of the big sample size got together and said, okay, SoundHound clearly belongs higher in that moment, because that volume is out of context for what's typically expected. We move later in the day, and I know some of you are looking at this. Listen, for me, there's too much randomness involved when you're only dealing with 1.5 to 2 consecutive bars. I need to see more consistency, meaning 3 to 4 or more consecutive bars. Now, later in the day, this is the kind of volume profile that can kind of hang up some people who are a little newer at looking at the volume profile. That's completely okay, by the way. Let's work through this together. This is an obvious upside move, a big upside move nonetheless. Okay, this volume profile looks very mixed. However, when you start to decide, okay, this correlates with a big upside move in stock price net, and then you have massively out of context volume, sure, there are some red bars mixed in, but, you know, even if I'm a bear on SoundHound right now, like I know some of you may be, we have to look at this and say, well, the bulls clearly came out ahead in this region, because clearly the big sample size of the market got together and said, we're going to offer this thing up. Right? This was not a battle, a sideways battle on high volume. This was the bulls pushing through the fence, the bears putting up a decent fight and just contributing to that volume pump, but ultimately the bulls winning the move in stock price. I mean, it's relatively obvious. You have to consider both the volume profile and the chart at the same time. Okay, but that's that moment, right? That's one factor of many. In the after hours, I typically don't do volume profile analysis in the after hours, but we have some volume here. Truthfully, this is relatively contextual. Stay with me here. This is relatively contextual in the context of it being a high volume after hours. Okay, and we'll talk about a couple of reasons once we get to the daily. Had we had, 3, 4, 5 green bars that topped 1.5 million, 2 million shares consistently in the after hours, well, all of a sudden that push to 1054 has a huge bias. But in this case, obviously the bulls won the price move, but the volume profile, there's really not a lot here, at least if we're going to actually do this for good reason, right, and remain as unbiased as possible. There's not a lot here in the volume profile to give to either side in the after hours. So we have to remain unbiased, otherwise there's no reason in doing this at all. Let's move on now to the psychological self-fulfilling prophecy levels on the 30-minute chart that I'm watching come tomorrow. Now, of course, we have some volatility in the after hours, not unexpected at all. Again, as previously stated, the real test is always market open the following day. Now, here on the 30-minute chart, I have the most psychological indicators you could possibly slap on a chart with the most eyeballs. The 50 period, that white line, and the 200 period, that gray line. Bulls. Any retest of the 50 period. It is curling upside aggressively now. But any retest at all of that 50 period, I'm going to want to see a clean hold. I don't mind the volume on the test, but a high volume bounce away from that hold. The bounce I need to see on high volume. Big sample size comes in and agrees. The worst thing you can see is a tiny little volume bounce. Because it's a tiny sample size. We don't know what the bigger sample size actually believes here because they're not participating. But the most ideal scenario if you're a bull here on SoundHound tomorrow is just to see the stock obviously hold, but the 50 period to curl upside and gain as much ground as possible, get an additional psychological barrier up underneath the move from today as quickly as possible to add just one more little factor of doubt into the bear's heads. That's really your goal as a bull. You want as many psychological barriers getting up underneath a new move as soon as you possibly can. The 50 period on the 30-minute chart is one of those. Now, bears, 2 things that you guys would love to see here tomorrow. First of all, a flattening out of the 50 period. Because if this thing continues to curl upside, all that does is add another psychological downside barrier higher. Right? You don't want that if you're a bear. And number two, if we go off the current after hours price, that's a 21% downside move to that 50 period where it sits right now. If we go off the closing price, that's a 14.5% downside move to that 50 period. You're asking for a big move, but the best case scenario if you're a bear, because it is a volatile name, would be a downside break of the 50 period here on the 30-minute chart and a hold. High volume downside break, low volume retest, and bulls, this is what you guys obviously would not want to ideally see. And then a high volume pull away. That is a short-term reclaim of the 50 period as resistance, which as a bear is your best case scenario. All right, now let's move on here to the 4-hour chart and take a look. You can see that the 4-hour is a little bit less contextual because this 50 period is going to take a lot of time to get upside, but I'm still paying attention. Bulls, just one simple thing. As much ground as possible covered by this 50 period each day on the 4-hour is a great thing to see. Bears, a flattening out ahead of each, potential psychological barrier in stock price, each round number, of course, and being where SoundHound currently is in terms of stock price, I think each 50 as well can act as a psychological area of resistance and or support. Now, this 50 period on the 4-hour has already claimed 6, so the bears kind of lost the battle of keeping that psychological barrier below 6, but we already kind of expected that yesterday when we covered SoundHound. But bears just slowing that barrier down ahead of like 650 would be ideal for you guys. Claiming as little ground each day as possible to just keep this gap big, right? To keep all your peers, other bears, on the same page that, hey, this thing's kind of trading on thin air. Whereas bulls, you want the opposite of that. You want the bears creeping in and looking at all the charts and saying, this thing has psychological potential support on the 30-minute, the 4-hour is creeping up now. Oh, the daily has this psychological potential level of support at this round number, which we'll get to. But the name of the game, of course, in the long term, the fundamentals always win. That's the way the market operates in the very extended long term. But the truth is, in the short term, this is simply a game of psychology. Okay, this is not a game of magic indicators. I do not want these videos at all to come off that way. The reason we look at these is because it's my belief that TA is nothing more, nothing less than a self-fulfilling prophecy. And by the way, that's exactly how I like it. But in order to study the psychology, we have to look at volume, obviously price movement, the psychological round numbers, which in this case are each round number and the 50, I would argue, and the most popular indicators we could possibly put on a chart that have the most eyeballs, which happen to be the 50 period and 200 period moving averages. Now, all that being said, let's move on here to the most important chart of all. That's going to be the daily. Now, I'm actually going to leave this zoomed out for a second because two things. The daily does not show after hours movement here. At least on my charts, it doesn't. This is the closing price. After hours, we're currently at 964 as of this very second. Okay, of course, volatile. What's really interesting is if we look here, the high of this candle, if you look, it might be hard to see if you're watching on a phone, but if you look to the right under where it says like scalp 1 minute, 5 minute, 30 minute, 4-hour, 2-year daily and price level, right under there, you can see it says H and then 873. That's the high of that candle. That's a daily candle for June 1st, 2022. Today, you get a high of 873. And that high, if we go to the 30 minute, was heading right into the close. What happened in the after hours, we broke through that level, and momentum picks up when you break a huge macro level like that and pushed up toward 1050. Okay, that's of course a factor here in the after hours. Now, if we take a look zoomed in on the daily, we want the most simple story possible, right? That's the most contextual, and it's the one that has the most eyeballs. The moving averages, not relevant here on the daily. I'm not even going to talk about them. Okay? What's the obvious story tomorrow? Well, the obvious story to me is a couple of levels. 873 was obviously respected into the close because it was that high back on June 1st, 2022. That is obviously a level to be watching. On top of that, we have the round number of $9 a share, and we have the most important number of all, $10. bulls. If SoundHound in regular hours could claim 10 and spend a bulk of time above 10, I don't mean 3 minutes, I don't mean 22 minutes, I mean hours above $10 a share tomorrow with a lot of volume coming in, that's a big sample size agreeing that, you know, at least for the time being, it belongs above 10 bucks a share, and close above 10. That becomes a huge power move from the bulls. Bears, your biggest power move here tomorrow is to fade this after hours move and close back below 873. You know, I don't mean the last 1 minute bar of the day either. I mean, get back down there and spend some time. Similar to how the bulls want to spend some time above 10, get back down below that 873 level, which is obviously an important technical level. Technical levels almost always, if they're respected enough, turn into psychological levels, and psychological levels almost always turn into technical levels. It almost always ends up being both. So bears, back below 873, that cracks that downside, you know, what a lot of bulls might look at as a potential support level. And also bears, that would discourage your enemy, so to speak, which is the bull. Right? Bulls, how do you discourage the most amount of bears possible? I think you do that by cracking and holding 10 bucks a share for a good amount of time, right? And closing above that level. Again, huge power move. Bears, 873, I think is the area to watch. Now, my favorite part of the video here. What was the bias? I'm so interested to see this here today. Now, of course, this doesn't include after hours movement, but we saw a big move in regular hours as well. What was the bias out of options traders who were traded today? This is all just from today, positioning themselves heading into tomorrow. Big sample size today, quite a bit more than normal. 393,000 total contracts traded. We had about 316,000 calls and about 78,000 puts. Big call side bias in SoundHound stocks chain here today. Now, really interesting, if we break this down by delta range, you can see here that the shorter term delta range, the 0 to 20, 19,800 calls, 28,670 puts, that actually has a slight put side bias. Okay, those are those shorter term speculators. So we're getting a little bit of shorter term speculators betting against this move here today. Okay, but if we go down into the deeper in the money contracts, those more expensive, what is oftentimes seen as higher quality money, the volume gets bigger and the offset, the ratio, gets more extreme to the call side, which I think is really interesting, contributing to that high call bias on the overall call per ratio. Really interesting here today. Listen, I want to make this very clear. You can learn everything you need to learn for free. I did not spend a dime. A lot of people are shocked by this. I did not spend a dime to learn how to trade. I basically scoured resources for years and put everything together through trial and error. It took me a while. And if you have that time and you really want to dedicate all that time to this craft, I encourage you to do so. You can do it for free. But if one of your main goals is to try to expedite the process and still do it right, I think a resource or a coach that you trust can be an invaluable resource. If that's your goal, to try to expedite the process and learn from mistakes, then I think a great bet is a resource like our Roensch Capital Gold server. I'm in there every day, sending out my personal scalp setup alerts, in-place stock alerts, human verified unusual options activity, and working with my Platinum one-on-one group every single day. Again, only I think if your goal is to try to expedite the process, I think that is very valuable. It's at that link in the pinned comment, but I encourage you again, if you have the time, you can do this for free. But I will warn you, it probably took me longer than it should have. But, you know, part of me, I suppose, is proud that I did it without spending any money. But I guess you could argue that I spent a lot of tuition losing it to the market early on. Anyway, listen, hey, if you want to take a look, it's at that link in the pinned comment. If you got value out of this video on your way out, please subscribe to the channel. I greatly appreciate it. And I'll see you in the next one.